They owed me $187,000 in undocumented loans I made to keep the team afloat. Yet the morning after our humiliating 4-0 home collapse, the board released a statement naming me as the primary reason for the tactical failure and froze every payment I was due. I sat there staring at the bank statements that proved exactly who had diverted those funds into private accounts. And I knew the only way forward was to file the papers that would drag them all into federal review and strip the club of its license if necessary. What they didn't count on was how meticulously I had documented every single transaction. For 10 straight seasons, I had been the steady presence in midfield, the one who showed up for every training session, every recovery drill, every late-night video analysis, while most of the squad rotated through injuries and attitude problems. My body paid the price with 2 reconstructed knees and a shoulder that still clicks when I lift anything heavier than a water bottle. But the real cost was financial. Between 2016 and 2025, I transferred a total of $187,400 from my personal accounts into club operating expenses that never appeared on any official ledger. Those wires were labeled simply as family support or equipment advance in my banking app. But every one of them came with a handwritten receipt signed by the general manager and a board member. I kept the scanned copies in a password-protected folder on my laptop, time-stamped and backed up to an external drive. I never asked for interest. I never asked for publicity. I just wanted the club to stay competitive in the V-League. When sponsorship checks were late, I covered the bus fuel for away games. When the academy needed new kits, I wired the invoice amount directly to the supplier. When the medical staff ran out of tape and anti-inflammatories before a crucial derby, I paid out of pocket and handed the receipts to the finance officer. Over the years, those small rescues added up. $187,400 is not pocket change for a domestic league midfielder, even one who had been captain for 6 of those seasons. The club never recorded those contributions as loans or investments. They treated them as gifts, as loyalty. In team meetings, the chairman would smile and say, "Kane is our backbone," while the accountants quietly moved the numbers around so the balance sheet looked clean for the league auditors. I let it slide because I believed in the project. I believed that if we kept climbing the table, the rewards would come later. I turned down better offers from clubs in Thailand and Malaysia because the board promised me a long-term coaching role once my playing days ended. They even put it in an email dated March 12, 2023, subject line, "Future Role Assurance." I printed that email and filed it with the rest of the documentation. By the start of the 2025 season, I had given everything. My wife and I had postponed having a second child because the travel schedule and the financial uncertainty made it impossible. I sold my second motorcycle to help cover one more utility bill the club could not pay. I told myself it was temporary. Then came the match that changed everything. We were hosting a mid-table rival at our home ground on a humid Saturday evening. The stadium was only 60% full, but the fans who showed up expected a statement win. I started in central midfield as usual, wearing the captain's armband. The first half was tight, 0-0, but I could feel something was off. Our pressing was disorganized, the wingers were not tracking back, the defensive line pushed too high even though we had practiced the opposite shape all week. At halftime, the coach gave a standard speech, but his eyes kept darting to the board member sitting in the VIP box. I remember thinking the tension in the dressing room felt heavier than usual. The second half unraveled in 17 minutes. 3 goals in quick succession, each one exposing a different structural failure. The fourth came in stoppage time on a counterattack that should never have happened if we had maintained our shape. Final score? 0-4. The loudest boos I had ever heard rained down as we left the pitch. I walked straight to the tunnel without looking at the crowd. In the dressing room, the atmosphere was dead silent, except for the sound of cleats being kicked into lockers. The next morning, the official club statement dropped on all social channels at 8:17 a.m. It read, in part, "The tactical breakdown and lack of leadership on the field point directly to senior players who failed to execute the game plan." My name was not mentioned, but everyone knew who the senior player with the armband was. Within hours, local sports sites ran headlines calling me the scapegoat. Comments flooded in accusing me of being past my prime, of dragging the team down. None of those articles mentioned the 4 clear scoring chances we created that our strikers wasted, or the fact that our starting goalkeeper had been dealing with an undisclosed wrist injury that affected his distribution. By 10 a.m., my phone stopped receiving notifications from the club group chat. My access to the team's internal training app was revoked. The finance officer sent a one-line email saying all pending payments were under review due to the league's impending investigation into the loss. That included the $45,000 in salary arrears from the previous 4 months and the performance bonuses I had earned but never collected. The message ended with a polite request to return any club property by the end of the week. I stared at the screen for a long time before I opened the folder containing 10 years of bank statements, receipts, and emails. That was the moment I understood the first hidden truth behind the shocking defeat. The loss had been convenient. It gave the board the perfect cover to erase years of financial irregularities by blaming the one player who had kept the lights on with his own money. I did not panic. I did not call anyone in anger. Instead, I opened a new spreadsheet and began listing every transaction with date, amount, purpose, and the name of the person who had acknowledged receipt. I cross-referenced each entry with my personal bank records and the scanned handwritten notes. By midday, I had a clean, chronological record spanning from March 2016 to August 2025. The total still read $187,400. I saved the file, encrypted it, and emailed a copy to myself at a private address I rarely used. Then I picked up the phone and dialed the only person I knew who could help me turn facts into legal pressure. His name was Mr. Tran, a sports law specialist based in Ho Chi Minh City who had handled contract disputes for several V-League players in the past. I had never needed him before, but I had kept his number. When he answered, I spoke calmly. I have detailed financial records showing personal loans to my club totaling over $180,000. The club has now publicly blamed me for a heavy defeat and frozen all payments owed to me. I need to understand my options under Vietnamese labor law and the V-League regulations. He asked for a summary of the documents. I sent the spreadsheet and a selection of scanned receipts. Within 2 hours, he called back. His voice was measured. This is not just a contract issue. This has elements of both civil breach and potential criminal misappropriation of funds. We need to move carefully, but quickly. First step is to send a formal demand letter, citing the specific bank transfer references and demanding immediate repayment plus interest calculated at the legal rate. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and reviewed the demand letter Mr. Tran had drafted. It listed 23 separate wire transfers with exact dates, amounts, and reference numbers. It referenced the March 2023 email promising future coaching stability. It demanded full repayment within 14 days and threatened escalation to both civil court and the Vietnam Football Federation Disciplinary Committee if the club failed to respond. I read every line twice, made one small correction on a date, and hit send on the encrypted attachment. The email went to the club chairman, the general manager, and the finance officer, with Mr. Tran copied as my legal representative. The response came faster than I expected. At 6:42 p.m. the same day, the club's lawyer replied with a short note claiming all payments had been discretionary goodwill gestures with no formal loan agreement, and that any attempt to link them to the recent match result would be considered defamatory. The email also stated that my exclusion from the squad was a sporting decision, unrelated to finances. Attached was a one-page internal memo dated the day after the match that described my on-field performance as below expected leadership standards and recommended my removal from the first-team environment. I forwarded the entire exchange to Mr. Tran without comment. His reply was simple. They just handed us the second hidden truth. They are already building a paper trail to discredit you. We need to file the civil suit before they can solidify that narrative. The next 48 hours were a blur of paperwork and quiet phone calls. Mr. Tran arranged a meeting with a forensic accountant who specialized in sports organizations. We met in a small conference room in Da Nang. The accountant, a woman in her late 40s named Ms. Lei, reviewed my spreadsheet for 3 hours straight. She asked for original bank statements and any screenshots of mobile banking confirmations. By the end of the session, she had identified 3 additional patterns I had not noticed. First, several large sponsorship deposits from a local construction company had been routed through an intermediary account before reaching the club's main ledger, with portions missing. Second, payroll records for the month of the match showed several ghost entries for players who had not been in the squad. Third, my own delayed salary payments had been reclassified in the club's internal system as performance deductions, without any supporting match data. Ms. Lee closed her laptop and said, "These are not accounting errors. These are deliberate misstatements. We can prove diversion of at least $60,000 in the last 18 months alone." Armed with that analysis, Mr. Tran prepared the formal complaint to the V-League Disciplinary Board. The document was 27 pages long. It included my full transaction history, the forensic summary, copies of the signed receipts, the 2023 email, and a timeline showing how the club's financial distress had worsened in parallel with my personal contributions. The complaint requested an immediate audit of the club's accounts, suspension of any further squad changes until the financial issues were clarified, and provisional reinstatement of my salary payments pending resolution. A separate civil lawsuit was filed in the Da Nang People's Court, seeking repayment of the principal plus compound interest, damages for reputational harm, and legal costs. I signed every page in the presence of a notary on a Thursday morning. The court clerk stamped the documents and handed me the case number. As I walked out of the courthouse, the humidity pressed down on my shoulders, but for the first time in days, the weight felt manageable. I had crossed the line from silent contributor to active claimant. The club now had 30 days to respond. I knew they would not go quietly. What mattered was that the evidence was now part of the official record, time-stamped and impossible to erase. That evening, I sat on my balcony overlooking the city lights and opened a new notebook. On the first page, I wrote a single heading, Hidden Truths. Under it, I listed the first 2 I had already uncovered. The convenient loss, the immediate financial cutoff, and character assassination. I did not write with anger. I wrote with precision, noting the exact dates, the exact amounts, the exact wording from the emails and statements. I knew there were more layers to peel back. The forensic accountant had only scratched the surface. The real audit would come once the league and the court started demanding full ledgers. I closed the notebook and looked out at the dark sea in the distance. 10 years of my life had been poured into a system that treated loyalty as a one-way street. Now the system was being forced to look at the receipts. The board thought a single bad result and a well-worded press release would bury everything. They were wrong. The documents I held told a different story, one backed by bank codes, transfer confirmations, and notarized signatures. And those documents were just the beginning. The club's reply to the formal demand letter arrived exactly 12 days after we sent it, delivered by courier to Mr. Tran's office in Ho Chi Minh City. It was 14 pages of carefully worded denial. They acknowledged receiving certain funds from me over the years, but classified every transfer as a voluntary donation made without expectation of repayment. They attached a single scanned document they claimed was a release form I had supposedly signed in 2022, stating that all prior contributions were gifts to the club. The signature on that form looked similar to mine, but the date was impossible. On that exact day, I had been in the hospital undergoing an MRI on my left knee after a training collision. I still had the hospital receipt and the team doctor's note confirming I was under sedation most of the afternoon. The forgery was clumsy, but it revealed the third hidden truth behind the 4-0 collapse. The board had been preparing their defense long before the match even kicked off. Mr. Tran called me the same afternoon. His tone remained calm and procedural. They just created a paper trail that works in our favor. A forged release dated to a day you were medically incapacitated gives us clear evidence of document tampering. We will include this in the amended complaint and request the court to appoint a handwriting expert. In the meantime, the V-League Disciplinary Board has acknowledged receipt of our filing and has scheduled an initial review hearing for next Wednesday. They have also issued a temporary order preventing the club from making any further public statements about your performance until the financial matters are addressed. I spent the next 3 days organizing the new evidence. I pulled the original hospital records, the MRI images with timestamps, and the team physician's official report. I scanned everything at 300 dpi and created a separate folder labeled Forgery Exhibit A. Ms. Lay, the forensic accountant, joined us on a video call and walked through the club's attached financial summary. She pointed out 3 additional discrepancies. First, a $200,000 sponsorship payment from a major beverage brand had been recorded in the club's books as only $140,000, with the difference routed through a personal account belonging to the chairman's nephew. Second, several player appearance fees for the month of the match had been inflated on paper, while actual bank outflows were significantly lower. Third, my own salary arrears had been rebooked as training camp expenses, even though no such camp had occurred. Each entry carried a specific transaction reference that could be traced back to the club's primary banking portal. On the morning of the V-League hearing, I wore a plain dark shirt and arrived at the Federation headquarters in Hanoi by train. The room was smaller than I expected, with a long wooden table and representatives from 5 different clubs present as observers. The disciplinary panel consisted of 3 officials, 2 of whom had overseen previous salary dispute cases. Mr. Tran presented our position first. He spoke for 28 minutes, citing specific bank transfer numbers, the forged release document, and the timeline showing how my contributions had directly supported operations during periods when official revenue had dropped by 38%. He ended by requesting an independent audit of the club's last 3 fiscal years and a provisional ban on the chairman and general manager from any football-related activities pending the outcome. The club's lawyer responded with a rehearsed defense. He repeated the donation narrative and tried to pivot the discussion back to on-field performance, claiming the 4-0 loss was solely due to tactical execution failures. The panel chairman interrupted him, politely but firmly. We are here to examine the financial allegations first. Match analysis will be handled separately if necessary. The lawyer then produced a second document, this one claiming I had verbally agreed to waive all claims during a team dinner in 2024. I had attended that dinner, but I had left early due to a migraine and had never spoken privately with any board member. Mr. Tran asked for proof of the conversation. The lawyer could only offer a 1-sentence note written by the general manager after the fact. The panel requested time to review all submitted materials and scheduled a follow-up session in 14 days. While the hearing was underway, my phone vibrated with a notification from my banking app. A new message from the club's finance department had arrived. It stated that due to the ongoing league investigation, all player contracts were being placed under temporary suspension, and that any outstanding payments would be held until the matter was resolved. Attached was a PDF listing my name at the top with a balance due of $45,800, now reclassified as disputed goodwill payments. I forwarded it immediately to Mr. Tran. His reply came within minutes. This is the 4th hidden truth. They are attempting to use the league process itself to stall repayment and create the appearance of legitimacy. We will file an urgent motion for interim relief, asking the court to order immediate release of the owed salary while the full case proceeds. Back in Da Nang that evening, I reviewed the growing file. The folder now contained 147 separate documents. Bank statements, wire confirmations, emails, medical records, forensic summaries, and hearing transcripts. I added the new suspension notice as Exhibit 47. I did not dwell on the personal cost. Instead, I focused on the procedural next steps. Mr. Tran had advised me to avoid all contact with former teammates or club staff to prevent any claim of witness tampering. I followed that instruction strictly, even when 2 former teammates sent private messages asking what was happening. I replied to neither. The civil court in Da Nang accepted our amended complaint 3 days later. The filing included the new forgery evidence and requested a freeze on any club assets up to the amount of my claim plus estimated legal costs. The judge assigned to the case was known for handling commercial disputes efficiently. She set the first hearing for the following month and ordered both parties to exchange full disclosure of financial records within 21 days. The club responded by requesting an extension, citing the complexity of their accounting system. The judge granted 14 additional days, but warned that further delays would result in default judgment. During that waiting period, Ms. Lay completed her preliminary audit report. She had gained limited access to the club's banking portal through a court-ordered subpoena. The report identified 5 separate instances where sponsorship and ticket revenue had been diverted into 3 different personal accounts linked to board members. The total diverted amount across those entries exceeded $94,000 in the 18 months leading up to the shocking defeat. One particularly clear transaction showed a $72,000 payment from the stadium naming rights sponsor that was split, $40,000 recorded as club income. The remaining $32,000 transferred the same day to an account belonging to the chairman's wife. The reference note in the club ledger simply read, "consulting fee," despite no consulting contract existing in the official files. I read the report twice, highlighting the transaction codes in yellow. Each code matched entries in my own records where I had covered shortfalls caused by those very missing funds. The pattern was now undeniable. The board had been systematically draining the club while relying on my undocumented support to keep operations running. When the money ran dry and the results suffered, they chose the 4-0 loss as the moment to cut me loose and rewrite the narrative. That realization did not make me bitter. It clarified the path forward. Every new piece of evidence strengthened the case for both repayment and accountability. Mr. Tran scheduled a strategy meeting for the following week. We reviewed the disclosure timeline and prepared a list of additional witnesses, including the team doctor who could confirm my hospital stay on the forged document date and the stadium manager who had direct knowledge of the sponsorship payment flows. We also prepared a formal request to the Vietnam Football Federation to suspend the club's participation in the next season's competition until the audit was completed and all player debts settled. The request cited specific articles in the league regulations regarding financial fair play and protection of player contracts. As the disclosure deadline approached, the club's responses grew more evasive. They submitted partial bank statements that omitted key months and claimed certain records had been lost during a server upgrade. Mr. Tran countered by filing a motion for spoliation sanctions, arguing that the selective disclosure itself constituted obstruction. The judge agreed to review the motion at the upcoming hearing and warned both sides that any further incomplete submissions would be viewed unfavorably. I spent the quiet evenings updating the master timeline in my notebook. Each entry now included the corresponding court exhibit number. The list of hidden truths had grown to 4. The convenient loss, the immediate financial cutoff, the pre-prepared forged documents, the use of the league process to stall justice. I knew the 5th truth would surface during the discovery phase once the full ledgers were forced into the open. I did not rush. I simply kept organizing, cross-referencing, and preparing the next set of questions for the forensic team. The court hearing date arrived on a Tuesday morning. I sat beside Mr. Tran at the plaintiff's table, wearing the same dark shirt. The club's representatives arrived with 2 lawyers and the finance officer. The judge began by confirming the disclosure status. When the club admitted they could not produce complete records for 3 critical months, she issued an immediate order requiring them to provide the missing statements within 72 hours or face contempt proceedings. She also granted our request for an asset freeze on the chairman's personal properties up to the claimed amount. As the gavel came down, I watched the finance officer's face tighten. For the first time, the board understood that the documents I had kept so quietly for 10 years were now controlling the pace of events. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun felt sharper. I walked to a nearby cafe, ordered a black coffee, and opened my notebook to a fresh page. I wrote the heading for the 5th hidden truth, even though I did not yet have all the details. I knew it would involve the full extent of the ghost contracts and the way player bonuses had been manipulated to hide cash outflows. I did not need to speculate. The court would compel the evidence soon enough. Until then, I would continue the work, one document, one transaction reference, one procedural step at a time. The case was no longer about a single bad result on a humid Saturday evening. It had become a methodical examination of how a professional football club had operated for years while depending on the unrewarded sacrifices of one player. The board had chosen public humiliation as their exit strategy for me. I had chosen the legal system as mine for them. The numbers, the dates, the signatures, and the bank codes would decide the outcome. And so far, the records were speaking clearly in my favor. The 72-hour deadline for the missing bank statements passed without full compliance. The club submitted only partial PDFs that covered 2 of the 3 requested months and claimed the third month's records had been corrupted during a routine backup. The judge reviewed the submission during an emergency status conference called the following Monday. She listened to the club lawyer's explanation for exactly 4 minutes before issuing a formal spoliation order. Any evidence not produced by the new deadline of 10 days would be presumed to exist and to favor the plaintiff's claims. She also expanded the asset freeze to include the general manager's known vehicles and the chairman's secondary residence outside the city. The courtroom remained silent, except for the scratching of pens and the soft click of laptop keys. That single procedural ruling revealed the 5th hidden truth behind the shocking 4-0 defeat. The club had been running a parallel shadow accounting system designed to conceal cash flows long before any tactical failure on the pitch. Mr. Tran and I reviewed the order over a secure video call that same afternoon. He adjusted his glasses and spoke in the same measured tone I had come to rely on. This is leverage. The presumption of favorability means the court can accept our forensic reconstruction of the missing month as accurate unless they produce the originals. Miss Lay is already rebuilding the ledger using cross-referenced sponsor deposits and stadium ticket revenue logs we obtained from third-party vendors. We should have a complete shadow ledger ready within 6 days. Miss Lay delivered her updated report on the 7th day. The document was 42 pages of tables, transaction flows, and color-coded highlights. She had traced $87,000 in undocumented outflows during the missing month alone. $42,000 had gone to a construction company owned by the chairman's brother-in-law for supposed stadium repairs that never appeared in any work order or invoice from the grounds crew. Another $31,000 had been wired to an offshore account under the name of a shell consulting firm, with the description line reading only Player Recruitment Services. The remaining $14,000 had been withdrawn in cash over 3 separate days, each withdrawal occurring within 24 hours of a home match. None of those cash movements correlated with any legitimate team expense. The report attached screenshots of the original bank portal entries that the club had failed to delete before the backup issue conveniently arose. I printed the full report and placed it in a new binder labeled Exhibit Set 3, Shadow Ledger. I added handwritten tabs for each major diversion category. Then I sat down with the original notebook and wrote the 5th hidden truth in clear block letters. Systematic diversion of operational revenue into related party accounts, masked by manipulated payroll and ghost contracts. I listed the exact transaction IDs, dates, and destination account numbers. No commentary, no anger, only the data. The club's response to the spoliation order was a motion asking the court to reconsider, based on alleged technical difficulties with their cloud provider. The judge denied the motion within 48 hours and scheduled the next full hearing for the discovery phase. At that hearing, the club was required to produce the chairman, the general manager, and the finance officer for questioning under oath. Mr. Tran prepared a list of 63 targeted questions focused exclusively on the bank records, the forged release document, and the cash withdrawals. I reviewed the questions line by line and suggested 3 additional ones concerning the exact wording of the internal memo that had blamed my leadership after the match. On the morning of the discovery hearing, I arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early. The air conditioning in the corridor hummed steadily. I carried only a thin folder containing the most critical transaction summaries. The club party arrived together, all 3 men in matching dark suits. They avoided eye contact as we entered the hearing room. The judge began promptly at 9 o'clock. She reminded everyone that the proceedings were being recorded and that any false statement could result in perjury charges under Vietnamese criminal code. Mr. Tran started with the chairman. He asked him to confirm the authenticity of the 2022 release form. The chairman hesitated, then claimed he had no personal knowledge of the document and that it had been prepared by the finance team. Mr. Tran placed the hospital records on the table and asked the chairman to explain how a player under sedation could have signed a legal waiver on that exact date. The chairman shifted in his chair and repeated that he had not been present. The judge noted the response and instructed the court reporter to mark it as evasive. The questioning moved to the general manager. He was asked about the $72,000 sponsorship payment that had been split. He claimed the $32,000 transferred to the chairman's wife was a legitimate family reimbursement for expenses incurred during a club event. When pressed for receipts, he stated they had been lost in the same backup failure. Mr. Tran then displayed the stadium naming rights contract on the screen. The contract clearly stated all payments were to be made directly to the club's designated account with no provision for family reimbursements. The general manager's face flushed, but he maintained the story. The finance officer faced the most detailed questions. Ms. Lay's shadow ledger was projected page by page. For each diverted transaction, the finance officer was asked to identify the authorizing signature and the supporting invoice. He could not produce a single complete set of documents. When questioned about the cash withdrawals, he claimed they were used for player incentives, not recorded in the official payroll, to avoid tax complications. Mr. Tran asked whether those incentives had been reported to the tax authority or the league. The finance officer admitted they had not. The judge made a note and reminded him again of the perjury statute. By the end of the 4-hour session, the court had a clear record of contradictory statements, missing documentation, and direct links between diverted funds and the club's inability to meet payroll obligations. The judge ordered the full shadow ledger admitted into evidence and set a trial date 6 weeks away. She also instructed the V-League to conduct its own parallel audit using the same documents and to report findings within 30 days. As we left the building, Mr. Tran turned to me and said quietly, "The sixth hidden truth is now on the record. The club's financial distress was not caused by poor results. The poor results were the inevitable outcome of years of internal looting that your personal loans were temporarily papering over." I returned to Da Nang that evening and updated the notebook once more. The list now read: 1. The convenient loss as public cover. 2. Immediate financial cutoff and character assassination. 3. Pre-prepared forged release documents. 4. Weaponization of the league process to stall repayment. 5. Systematic diversion of revenue into related party accounts. 6. Manipulation of payroll and creation of ghost contracts to hide cash flows. 6 layers of the operation had been exposed through procedural pressure rather than shouting or public accusations. The evidence spoke in the language of bank codes, timestamps, and notarized medical reports. I did not celebrate. I simply added the new court transcript pages to the master file and began preparing the witness list for the main trial. The V-League audit team arrived at the club offices 2 days later. They were granted access under the league's regulatory authority and worked with Ms. Lay to cross-check the shadow ledger against official submissions. Within 10 days, they issued an interim report confirming material misstatements in the club's financial filings for the previous 2 seasons. The report recommended provisional suspension of the club from all league activities until player debts were settled and governance reforms were implemented. The chairman responded by calling an emergency board meeting. According to a source inside the building, who later provided a sworn affidavit, the meeting ended with raised voices and the general manager storming out after being told he would have to personally cover part of the shortfall. I received a copy of the league's interim report through Mr. Tran. I read it carefully, noting the specific paragraphs that reference my transaction history as the only documented external support the club had received during the period of revenue diversion. The report stopped short of criminal referral, but strongly suggested the Federation forward the file to the Ministry of Public Security for further review of potential embezzlement. With the trial date approaching, Mr. Tran scheduled daily preparation sessions. We rehearsed my testimony, focusing on factual recitation of dates, amounts, and purposes without speculation. He emphasized that the strongest impression on the judge would come from calm, precise answers supported by documents, rather than emotional narrative. I practiced until each response felt automatic. I also prepared a short statement to read, if permitted, at the close of my testimony. It contained no demands for apology and no personal attacks. It simply restated the total principal owed, the calculated interest at the legal rate, and my request that the court impose clear boundaries preventing the individuals involved from holding any future positions in Vietnamese professional football. The week before trial, the club made its first serious settlement overture. Their lawyers proposed repaying 60% of the principal over 18 months with no interest in a mutual non-disclosure agreement. Mr. Tran forwarded the offer to me with a one-line note: "Your decision." I read the proposal twice, then drafted a counteroffer demanding 100% of the principal plus accrued interest, full legal costs, and a public acknowledgement that my contributions had been loans, not donations. I added a condition that the chairman and general manager resign from all football-related roles effective immediately upon payment. The club rejected the counteroffer within 24 hours, but the fact that they had made any offer at all showed the pressure was working. I spent the final days before trial reviewing every exhibit one last time. The binders now filled 2 large boxes. Each tab corresponded to a specific hidden truth and the legal mechanism that had forced it into the open. I did not feel triumphant. I felt methodical. The system that had taken my time, my money, and my reputation for 10 years was now being examined under the same rules it had tried to ignore. The 4-0 scoreline that had once been used to bury me had instead become the catalyst that brought every irregular transaction into the light. On the eve of the first trial day, I closed the last binder and placed it beside the others. I poured a glass of water and stood at the window looking out over the lights of Da Nang. 10 years of quiet sacrifice had been reduced to columns of numbers and dated signatures. Those numbers were about to be read aloud in open court. The board had chosen public humiliation as their weapon. I had chosen the slow, relentless pressure of documented evidence and procedural compliance. The next morning, the gavel would fall, and the final hidden truths would be compelled to surface under oath. I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The documents were ready. The questions were prepared. The boundaries I intended to establish were clear and non-negotiable. Whatever the exact verdict, the record would show that one player had refused to let 10 years of unrewarded loyalty disappear into a convenient defeat. The trial opened on a humid Thursday morning in the main courtroom of the Da Nang People's Court. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Mr. Tran, dressed in the same dark shirt I had worn to every prior hearing. Across the aisle, the chairman, the general manager, and the finance officer sat with their 2 lawyers, all of them avoiding direct eye contact. The judge, a woman in her mid-50s known for strict adherence to procedural rules, entered precisely at 9 o'clock. She opened the session by reminding both sides that the proceedings would focus exclusively on the civil claims of breach of implied contract, unjust enrichment, and reputational harm, while any criminal aspects would be referred separately if evidence warranted. No shouting, no theatrics, just the steady presentation of facts drawn from bank records, emails, and sworn testimony. Mr. Tran began with my direct examination. He asked me to walk the court through the timeline of my contributions, starting with the first documented transfer on March 17, 2016. I spoke clearly, stating each date, each amount, and the exact purpose as recorded in my contemporaneous notes. When I reached the total of $187,400, I paused only long enough for the court reporter to catch up. I described how each transfer had been acknowledged by club officials through handwritten receipts or emails, never once using the word betrayal. I simply laid out the sequence: the club's repeated shortfalls in sponsorship and ticket revenue, my decision to bridge those gaps to keep the team training and traveling, and the complete absence of any repayment or formal acknowledgement once the 4-0 loss provided convenient cover. The cross-examination from the club's lead lawyer was predictable. He tried to characterize every payment as a gift motivated by personal loyalty rather than any expectation of return. I answered each question by referring back to the specific bank transfer reference numbers and the matching receipts. When he asked why I had never demanded repayment earlier, I replied that I had relied on the March 12, 2023 email promising future coaching stability, and that the club's own actions had never signaled any dispute until the morning after the defeat. He produced the forged 2022 release form again. I pointed to the hospital records already in evidence and noted that the signature date was medically impossible. The lawyer moved on quickly. The most revealing portion came when the chairman took the stand. Mr. Tran questioned him about the split sponsorship payment. The chairman repeated the earlier claim of a family reimbursement. Mr. Tran then displayed the full contract on the large screen and asked the chairman to read aloud the clause requiring all sponsor funds to be deposited directly into the club's designated account. The chairman read it in a low voice. When asked whether the $32,000 transferred to his wife's account complied with that clause, he hesitated for several seconds before saying it was an internal administrative matter. The judge asked him to clarify. He could not. The transcript would later show a long silence followed by an admission that no supporting invoice existed for the transfer. The general manager fared no better. When questioned about the cash withdrawals totaling $14,000 in the missing month, he again cited player incentives. Mr. Tran asked him to name the players who had received those incentives and to produce any signed acknowledgments. The general manager could name none and produced no documents. The judge noted the lack of corroboration and instructed the court reporter to highlight the response as unsupported by evidence. By the end of the first day, the court had heard testimony linking specific diverted funds to the exact shortfalls I had covered with my own transfers. The pattern was no longer allegation. It was documented sequence: revenue diverted, operations funded by me, public blame assigned to me when results collapsed. That evening, I added the seventh hidden truth to the notebook in steady handwriting. The 4-0 defeat was not the cause of the club's crisis, but the calculated moment chosen to sever ties with the player who had quietly financed the operation while the board extracted personal benefit. The second day focused on the forensic accounting evidence. Ms. Lee took the stand and walked the court through her shadow ledger page by page. She used simple charts projected on the screen to show how diverted sponsorship money had created artificial cash shortages that my transfers had temporarily filled. She testified that without my $187,400, the club would have been unable to field a full squad for at least 7 home matches during the period in question. The club's own lawyer tried to challenge her methodology, but Ms. Lay responded with calm references to standard Vietnamese accounting circulars and the specific bank portal logs that matched her reconstruction. The judge asked several clarifying questions and appeared satisfied with the answers. The finance officer's testimony followed. Under oath, he was forced to admit that several ghost player contracts had been created in the club's internal system to justify inflated expense claims to the league. When asked whether those ghost entries had any corresponding bank outflows to actual players, he stated they did not. Mr. Tran then connected those ghost entries to the exact months when my salary payments had been delayed and reclassified. The finance officer could offer no coherent explanation. The courtroom remained quiet, except for the sound of the court reporter's fingers on the keyboard. On the third day, the V-League audit team submitted its final report as an independent exhibit. The report confirmed material breaches of financial fair play regulations, including failure to pay player salaries on time, inaccurate submission of financial statements, and evidence of related party transactions not disclosed to the Federation. It recommended that the club be placed on probation for the next 2 seasons, with a potential points deduction or expulsion if player debts remained unpaid after 90 days. The report also noted that my documented loans represented the only verifiable external support received during the period of highest diversion. The club's closing argument attempted to separate the financial issues from the on-field performance. Their lawyer argued that the 4-0 loss was a sporting matter outside the court's jurisdiction, and that any repayment should be limited to a goodwill gesture without admission of liability. Mr. Tran's closing was shorter and more precise. He reminded the court that the evidence showed a clear pattern of unjust enrichment. The club had accepted and relied upon my funds to maintain operations, then used a public defeat to discredit me and avoid repayment. He asked the court to award the full principal of $187,400, interest calculated at the statutory rate from the date of each transfer, reimbursement of all legal and forensic costs, and a permanent injunction barring the chairman and general manager from holding any executive or coaching positions in Vietnamese professional football for a period of 5 years. The judge reserved her verdict and stated she would issue a written decision within 21 days. As we left the courtroom, the chairman passed close enough for me to hear his breathing, but neither of us spoke. Outside, the afternoon light reflected off the courthouse steps. I shook Mr. Tran's hand and thanked him for the calm, methodical way he had presented the case. He nodded once and said, "The evidence did the work. Now we wait for the ruling to translate it into enforceable boundaries." The 21 days passed with deliberate slowness. I used the time to organize my personal affairs. I canceled the automatic transfers I had once used to support the club. I updated my resume with a factual summary of my playing career and began quiet conversations with 2 lower division clubs that had expressed interest in a coaching role based on performance rather than loyalty. I made no public statements. I gave no interviews. The only record that mattered was the one now sitting on the judge's desk. On the morning the verdict was scheduled, I arrived at the courthouse with Mr. Tran. The judge read the decision aloud in clear, measured Vietnamese, then provided an English summary for the record. She found in my favor on all counts. The court ordered the club and the individual defendants jointly and severally liable for the full principal of $187,400 plus interest totaling $29,800. All legal and expert costs were to be reimbursed within 30 days. The chairman and general manager were permanently barred from any executive, coaching, or administrative roles in the V-League or any affiliated organization for 5 years. The court further recommended that the Vietnam Football Federation initiate disciplinary proceedings against the club, including possible expulsion if the judgment remained unpaid after 90 days. A copy of the full financial audit was to be forwarded to the Ministry of Public Security for review of potential criminal embezzlement charges. The gavel came down with a quiet finality. I did not smile or raise a fist. I simply closed my notebook and placed it in the folder with the other trial documents. Outside the courthouse, I stood for a moment under the shade of a tree and looked at the city skyline. 10 years of unrewarded sacrifice had been reduced to a set of enforceable numbers and clear legal boundaries. The club that had used a shocking 4-0 defeat to erase me now faced the consequences of its own records. Within 48 hours, the first payment of $50,000 arrived in my designated escrow account as ordered by the court. The league announced the club's provisional suspension from the upcoming season, pending compliance with the judgment and full repayment schedule. Local sports sites ran brief, factual articles noting the court outcome without sensational headlines. I read them once, then closed the browser. I used part of the first payment to settle outstanding medical bills from my knee surgeries and to open a small savings account for the child my wife and I had postponed for so long. The rest I placed in a conservative investment fund managed by a bank I had never done business with before. I drafted a short, formal letter to any future club that might approach me. It stated simply that I would consider coaching or advisory roles only under a fully documented contract with transparent financial terms, no undocumented loans, and clear performance-based compensation. No exceptions. The final hidden truth, the 8th, was the simplest and the most important. Loyalty without legal boundaries is not loyalty. It is an invitation to exploitation. I had learned that truth through a decade of quiet transfers and one public humiliation. Now the court had translated it into black and white orders that no press release or forged document could erase. I closed the master notebook for the last time and placed it on the shelf beside the trial binders. The pages contained every date, every bank reference, every court exhibit. They no longer needed to be reviewed daily. The boundaries were established. The money was returning on a court-mandated schedule. The individuals who had chosen to scapegoat me after the 4-0 collapse were now prohibited from repeating the pattern with any other player. I walked to the balcony, looked out over Da Nang Bay, and took a slow breath. The humid air felt lighter. 10 years of carrying the club on my back had ended, not with drama or revenge shouts, but with a quiet, procedural reclamation of what was owed, and a clear line drawn for whatever came next. The game continued. I would continue too, but only on terms the records could enforce. No more undocumented sacrifices. No more convenient defeats used as cover. Only facts, contracts, and boundaries that protected the time, the body, and the future I had left. The weeks following the verdict moved with the steady rhythm of enforced compliance rather than dramatic confrontation. The court's 30-day payment window began the day the written judgment was issued. On day 27, the club's lawyers requested an extension citing liquidity issues. The judge denied the motion the same afternoon and issued a contempt warning. Any further delay would trigger automatic asset seizure proceedings against the chairman's frozen properties. By day 29, the escrow account I had designated received the second tranche of $65,000. The transfer confirmation arrived via the court-appointed monitor with a timestamp and reference number that matched the judgment schedule exactly. I forwarded the confirmation to Mr. Tran without additional comment. He replied with one line: "The mechanism is working as designed." The V-League Disciplinary Committee convened its own session the following Monday. I was not required to attend. Mr. Tran represented the factual record to the court documents already submitted. The committee reviewed the full audit report, the judgment excerpts, and the payment compliance log. At the close of the 3-hour meeting, they announced a 2-season points deduction for the club, a requirement to publish an audited balance sheet within 45 days, and a formal warning that any further non-payment of player obligations would result in immediate expulsion from the league. The chairman was present via video link. According to the official minutes, he made no statement when the sanctions were read. I received the committee's written decision the next morning. I added it as the final document in the master binder and labeled the tab League Sanctions Post-Judgment. The page now contained the complete chain: my original spreadsheet of transfers, the forensic shadow ledger, the court verdict, the payment confirmations, and the league penalties. 8 hidden truths had been compelled into the public record through procedural steps rather than public spectacle. No press conference, no viral video, only the quiet accumulation of bank codes, court stamps, and regulatory orders. With the immediate financial pressure eased, I turned my attention to the practical boundaries I had decided to establish for the rest of my career. I met with Mr. Tran one final time in his Ho Chi Minh City office. We drafted a standard template contract clause that I would require in any future agreement. The language was precise. All financial contributions, loans, or advances by the player to the club must be documented in a separate loan agreement with defined repayment terms, interest rate, and security. Verbal understandings or undocumented transfers shall be considered null and void. We also included a clause requiring monthly financial transparency reports to be shared with the squad captain during the season. Mr. Tran reviewed the wording twice, made 2 small adjustments for compliance with current labor circulars, and saved the file as Kane's Standard Protective Addendum, version 1.0. I printed 3 copies and placed them in a new folder labeled Future Boundaries. That folder would travel with me to any contract negotiation. It contained the court judgment summary, the league sanctions excerpt, and the protective addendum. Nothing more. No emotional narrative, only the tools that would prevent the same pattern from repeating with another player who might be tempted to carry a club on undocumented faith. The club made its 3rd payment on schedule, bringing the total received to $145,000. The remaining balance, plus final interest, was due in 2 equal installments over the next 60 days. The court monitor confirmed each transfer with an official receipt. I used the incoming funds to complete the down payment on a small apartment in a quiet district of Da Nang, one that required no club connections and carried a clean title in my wife's name. The remaining amount went into a dedicated education fund for the child we were now actively planning. Each allocation was recorded in a simple household ledger, with date, amount, and purpose. The habit of documentation had become permanent. Local football circles began to shift quietly. 2 former teammates reached out through neutral channels, asking for advice on their own delayed contracts. I responded with the same measured advice Mr. Tran had given me. Compile every bank statement, every receipt, every email. Engage a sports lawyer early. Avoid public statements until the evidence file is complete. I did not offer to join any group complaint. I simply shared the procedural path that had produced results. One of the players later told me he had used the protective addendum language in his own renegotiation and secured written repayment terms for the first time in his career. I noted the outcome in my notebook under a new heading: Ripple Effect. Documented boundaries spreading. The club's league suspension remained in effect. Ticket sales for the upcoming season were halted. The academy program was placed under federation oversight. The chairman and general manager submitted their formal resignations, effective at the end of the month, citing personal reasons in the official announcement. The Federation accepted the resignations and barred both men from any future involvement under the 5-year injunction. A new interim board was appointed, consisting of 3 neutral administrators selected by the league. Their first public action was to issue a compliance statement, acknowledging the court-ordered repayments and committing to full transparency in future financial filings. I read the announcement once on my phone while sitting at the kitchen table. I did not forward it or comment on it. The cycle of concealment had been broken not by confrontation, but by the steady application of bank records, forensic analysis, and court-enforced deadlines. The 4-0 defeat that had once been weaponized against me now stood as the public marker of the moment the hidden accounting practices could no longer be sustained. In the quiet months that followed, I began coaching sessions with a group of under-17 players at a local academy, unaffiliated with any V-League club. The contract was short, fully documented, and paid on the 15th of each month with no exceptions. I arrived early for every session, reviewed video of the previous week's training, and left detailed notes on individual progress. No personal funds left my account for equipment, travel, or any other club expense. When the academy director once mentioned a temporary shortfall in kit supply, I referred him to the standard sponsorship application process listed on the Federation website. The conversation ended there. The boundary held. My wife and I welcomed our second child in the spring. The hospital stay was covered by the new insurance policy I had purchased with the first court payment. I kept the discharge papers and the insurance reimbursement confirmation in the same folder as the protective addendum. The habit of evidence collection had extended into family life in the healthiest way possible. 1 year after the verdict, I received a formal letter from the Vietnam Football Federation. It informed me that the club had completed all court-ordered repayments, including the final interest installment, and that the league suspension had been lifted under strict probation conditions. The letter also noted that the new board had implemented mandatory monthly financial disclosures to all registered players. A copy of the audited balance sheet for the previous quarter was attached. I scanned the document, filed it with the rest of the records, and closed the master binder for what I believed would be the final time. The 8 hidden truths behind the shocking 4-0 home collapse had been fully documented and resolved through legal and regulatory channels. 1. The defeat provided convenient public cover for years of internal financial mismanagement. 2. Immediate scapegoating and payment freeze were executed to sever ties with the player holding the evidence. 3. Forged release documents had been prepared in advance to nullify legitimate claims. 4. The league investigation process itself was weaponized to delay repayment. 5. Revenue from sponsorships and tickets had been systematically diverted into related party accounts. 6. Ghost contracts and manipulated payroll masked the true cash shortfalls. 7. The club's crisis was the direct result of internal extraction, not on-field performance failures. 8. Undocumented loyalty without legal boundaries invites exploitation and requires enforceable contracts to prevent repetition. I no longer carried the notebook daily. The facts had been tested in court, accepted by the league, and translated into binding orders. The money had returned. The individuals responsible had been removed from positions of influence. The system had been forced to acknowledge its own weaknesses through procedural pressure rather than emotional appeals. I stood on the same balcony where I had once reviewed the first set of bank statements. The bay stretched out under a clear sky. 10 years of sacrifice had not been erased, but they had been accounted for. The body that had given its knees and shoulder to the cause was now protected by clear contract language. The family that had waited was now supported by documented funds. The next chapter of my life in football would be written under terms that no hidden ledger could undermine. The game continues. Players will still sacrifice, clubs will still face pressure, and results will still sometimes shock the stands. What has changed is the boundary I established for myself and, through the public record, for others who might follow the same path. No more quiet transfers without receipts. No more loyalty mistaken for unlimited credit. Only facts, contracts, court stamps, and the calm certainty that when the next 4-0 defeat arrives, the documents will already be in place to reveal exactly what lies behind it. I closed the sliding door, sat down at the table, and opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, I wrote a single line in clear capital letters: Future Contract Checklist. Below it, I began listing the protective clauses Mr. Tran and I had drafted. The work of documentation never truly ends. It simply becomes the foundation for whatever comes next, built on evidence rather than assumption, on boundaries rather than blind faith. The story of the shocking defeat had concluded, not with revenge in the traditional sense, but with the quiet, procedural reclamation of what had been taken, and the establishment of safeguards that would outlast any single season or any single board. That was the only ending the records would support, and it was more than enough. The months after the final payment arrived carried a different kind of weight, one measured in cleared balances and newly signed contracts rather than outstanding claims. The club, now operating under probation with a neutral interim board, published its first fully audited financial statement in compliance with the league's new transparency rules. I received a courtesy copy through the Federation portal. The document ran 68 pages and included a dedicated section on historical player support obligations. In dry accountant's language, it acknowledged the court-ordered repayment of $187,400 in principal, plus $29,800 in statutory interest. No names were mentioned, but the transaction references match my records exactly. The report also disclosed that the related party transfers identified in Ms. Lay's shadow ledger had been reversed and reclassified as improper, with the individuals involved no longer associated with the club. I saved the PDF in the master folder, renamed it Final Compliance Audit Year +1, and closed the laptop. The eighth hidden truth had now been formally admitted by the system itself. I used the quiet period to complete my transition into coaching. A newly promoted V-League 2 side based in central Vietnam approached me through a neutral agent. The initial meeting took place in a small conference room at a hotel near the beach. The club president, a former player himself, slid a draft contract across the table. It was 22 pages long and contained the standard protective addendum Mr. Tran and I had prepared. Every clause on documented loans, monthly financial disclosures, and prohibition of undocumented advances was present and initialed in advance. I reviewed each page slowly, comparing the language to my template. Only 2 minor wording adjustments were needed for local tax compliance. I made the changes in red ink, signed every page, and slid the contract back. The president nodded once and said, "We read the judgment. We don't want that story here." The deal was sealed with a handshake and a notarized copy filed the same afternoon. My first salary deposit arrived on the 15th of the following month, exactly as stipulated. No wires from my personal account, no handwritten receipts. Only the clean, traceable payment into my designated payroll account. Training began the next week. I arrived at the pitch 40 minutes early each morning, clipboard in hand, reviewing the previous day's GPS data and video clips. The players were young, hungry, and still learning the value of structure. During the first team meeting, I distributed a 1-page handout titled Contract and Financial Clarity. It listed 3 simple rules. Every bonus or incentive must be written into the contract before the season starts. Any request for player contributions must be documented as a formal loan with repayment terms, and monthly balance sheets would be shared with the captain. I read the rules aloud without emphasis or drama. The room stayed quiet. At the end, one of the younger midfielders raised his hand and asked if this was because of what happened at my old club. I answered factually. It is because the record showed what happens when those steps are skipped. We will not skip them here. No further questions were asked. Practice continued. 6 weeks into the season, we faced our first real test, an away match against a rival with a history of strong home form. The game ended 1-1 after we conceded a late equalizer from a set piece. In the dressing room, the mood was subdued, but not broken. I reviewed the key moments on the tablet. Missed tracking on the second post, delayed pressing trigger, a momentary lapse in shape. The numbers were clear. 87% pass completion in our half, but only 63% in the final third. I listed the data points on the whiteboard without raising my voice. The players took notes. No one blamed the referee or the pitch. The next morning, we adjusted the pressing drill based on the exact timestamps from the match video. The process felt clean because the foundation was documented. Back in Da Nang, my wife and I settled into the new apartment. The second child, a daughter, slept through most nights now. I kept a small ledger on the kitchen counter for household expenses. Nothing elaborate, just dates, amounts, and categories. When the academy where I coached part-time needed new training cones, I directed the director to the Federation grant application instead of reaching for my wallet. The cones arrived 3 weeks later through official channels. The boundary held without effort now. It had become habit. The old club's probation period ended quietly at the close of the season. They finished mid-table with no further sanctions. The new board issued a short statement thanking the Federation for oversight and reaffirming their commitment to financial compliance. I read the statement once on my phone while waiting for a training session to begin. I felt no particular satisfaction or resentment. The judgment had been satisfied, the sanctions served, the individuals removed. The records were complete. That was the resolution the evidence had produced. One afternoon in the off-season, I received a message from Mr. Tran. He attached a short article from a legal journal that referenced our case as an example of effective use of forensic accounting in sports contract disputes. The piece was 4 pages long, dry and technical, citing the exact transaction volumes, the spoliation ruling, and the resulting league sanctions. It ended with a note on the importance of contemporaneous documentation by players. I saved the PDF in the same folder as the court judgment and labeled it Precedent Reference. No headline, no interview, just another layer of the official record. I continued updating the Future Contract Checklist notebook whenever I encountered a new clause worth preserving. By the end of the year, it contained 17 items, each tested against real negotiations or observed failures in other clubs. The list was not emotional. It was procedural. Require quarterly independent audits for clubs with revenue below a certain threshold. Mandate escrow accounts for performance bonuses. Include automatic interest accrual on late salary at double the legal rate. Each entry included the supporting regulation or court precedent. The notebook stayed thin because I added only what had proven effective. The following season, my new club earned promotion back to the top flight. The celebration in the dressing room was subdued. We had met every contractual obligation on time. The players received their full bonuses 2 days after the final whistle, transferred directly into their accounts with clear remittance notes. I stood at the edge of the group and watched the quiet satisfaction on their faces. No one asked me to cover travel costs or buy extra equipment. The protective language had done its job without needing to be invoked. In the years that followed, I watched from a distance as other players began referencing similar safeguards in their own contracts. A young defender at a rival club showed me his agreement during a national team camp. The addendum was almost identical to mine. He told me he had found the language through a federation circular that cited our case as best practice. I nodded and wished him well. The ripple had moved outward through the system itself, carried by documents rather than speeches. I never returned to the old stadium as a player or coach. When the fixture list placed my new team there for an away match, I prepared the tactical briefing with the same calm data review I used for every opponent. The game ended 2-1 in our favor. After the final whistle, I shook hands with the opposing staff, exchanged the standard pleasantries, and boarded the team bus. No words were spoken about the past. The court records had already said everything necessary. At home, the master binder remained on the shelf, unopened for months at a time. The daughter learned to walk in the living room while I reviewed training clips on the laptop. The son started kindergarten with the fees paid from the education fund that had grown steadily from the returned principal. Life moved forward under clear terms: documented income, documented expenses, documented boundaries. The shocking 4-0 defeat that had once threatened to define the end of my career had instead become the starting point for a different legacy, one built on the quiet power of bank statements, forensic ledgers, court orders, and contract language. 8 hidden truths had been forced into the light through procedural persistence rather than public outrage. The club had paid. The individuals had been removed. The league had adjusted its rules. And I had reclaimed not only the money, but the right to participate in the game on terms that protected the time, the body, and the future I still had left. I closed the laptop one evening after marking up the latest training video. The apartment was quiet, except for the soft sound of the children breathing in the next room. I stood at the balcony rail and looked out over the bay. The water reflected the city lights in steady, unbroken lines. 10 years of undocumented sacrifice had been accounted for. The next 10 years would be written under different rules, rules I had helped engrave into the system through evidence and endurance. The notebook labeled Future Contract Checklist lay open on the table behind me. I had added one more line that afternoon. Require all clubs to maintain a player contribution registry cross-referenced to audited accounts. The entry was factual, procedural, and enforceable. It was the only kind of revenge that lasted beyond any single season or any single board. The game would continue. Losses would still shock the crowd. Scandals would still surface. But for those willing to keep the records, the hidden truths would no longer remain hidden for long. The boundaries had been drawn. The documents would hold. And that was the quiet, complete ending the evidence had always pointed toward. The final chapter of the old club's probation ended without ceremony on a rainy Tuesday in late October. The Federation issued a one-paragraph notice confirming full compliance with the court judgment, the repayment schedule, and the 2-season points deduction. The club was restored to normal league status effective the next campaign. No press conference, no apologies, no public acknowledgement of the 8 hidden truths. Just a quiet, administrative update buried on page 4 of the weekly bulletin. I read it once while waiting for the morning training session to begin, saved the PDF, and closed the file. The system had corrected itself through its own mechanisms. That was enough. By then, my work at the promoted club had settled into a steady rhythm. We finished the V-League season in 8th place, respectable for a newly returned side. The squad received every contracted bonus within 72 hours of the final match, transferred with itemized remittance slips that listed exact performance metrics. No player asked for an advance. No one offered undocumented help. The protective addendum had become part of the club culture without ever needing to be enforced in court. During the end-of-season review meeting, the president handed me a small plaque recognizing my contribution to tactical stability and financial discipline. I accepted it with a brief nod, thanked the staff, and placed the plaque on a shelf at home next to the court binder. It carried no emotional weight, only the factual record of a job completed under clear terms. The following off-season, I received an invitation from the National Youth Setup to lead a series of coaching clinics for under-19 midfielders. The contract was 4 pages long, fully itemized, and paid in 3 equal installments through the Federation's official account. I reviewed the payment schedule against my checklist, signed, and began preparing the curriculum. The first clinic took place on a dew-covered pitch outside Hanoi. 23 young players stood in a semicircle while I projected clips from the previous season's matches. I paused on a specific sequence where a central midfielder had lost shape under pressure. The GPS data showed a 6-meter gap that should not have existed. I explained the numbers without raising my voice. Reaction time, pressing trigger, recovery distance. The players took notes in small notebooks of their own. At the end of the session, one of them asked how I had learned to read the game so precisely. I answered simply, by keeping records of what the numbers actually showed, not what people said they showed. No further explanation was needed. Back in Da Nang, the family routine had become comfortable. My daughter started first grade with a new backpack purchased from the education fund. My son joined the same academy where I volunteered 2 afternoons a week. I never paid for his kit or travel. The club covered everything through its documented budget, and when a shortfall appeared in the monthly report, the director applied for the standard Federation subsidy instead of asking parents. The process worked because the records required it to work. One quiet evening, I opened the master binder for the first time in nearly 2 years. The pages were still crisp, the tabs still labeled in my steady handwriting. I flipped through the exhibits slowly. The original spreadsheet of $187,400 in transfers. The forensic shadow ledger highlighting the $94,000 in diverted sponsorships. The hospital records disproving the forged release. The court transcript where the chairman could not explain the $32,000 family transfer. The league sanctions, and the final compliance audit. Each document carried its own court stamp or federation seal. Together, they formed a complete procedural map from quiet sacrifice to enforced reclamation. I closed the binder, placed it back on the shelf, and did not open it again. The story was no longer active. It had become precedent. The club that had once scapegoated me after the 4-0 collapse continued its quiet recovery. They finished mid-table the following season and avoided any new financial flags. The interim board was replaced by an elected group that maintained the monthly disclosure requirement. I received no direct communication from them, nor did I seek any. When our teams met in the league fixture, the matches were played, the handshakes exchanged, and the teams returned to their buses. The past existed only in the official records, not in daily conversation. I continued adding to the future contract checklist whenever a new regulatory circular or observed best practice appeared. By the third year, the notebook contained 24 items, each cross-referenced to the relevant article in the labor code or league regulations. I shared the updated version anonymously through the Players Union portal as a reference document. Within 6 months, 3 different clubs adopted versions of the protective addendum in their standard contracts. The Federation even referenced the language in a training module for new team captains. The change moved through the system like a slow, steady current, carried by documents rather than drama. My own playing days had ended years earlier, but the body that had carried the club for a decade still remembered every undocumented mile. The reconstructed knees ached in humid weather. The shoulder clicked when I demonstrated long passes. I managed the discomfort with documented physiotherapy sessions paid for by the coaching contract, never out of pocket. The records protected the future as effectively as they had reclaimed the past. One afternoon, in the 4th year after the verdict, I received a short email from Mr. Tran. He attached a new legal journal article analyzing our case alongside 2 similar disputes that had been resolved using the same forensic accounting approach. The piece was technical, citing exact transaction volumes, spoliation precedents, and the resulting regulatory changes in the V-League. It concluded that documented player contributions, when properly evidenced, could shift the balance of power in contract enforcement. I saved the article in the precedent folder and replied with 2 words: noted, thank you. No celebration, no reflection on justice served, only the quiet acknowledgement that the procedural path had proven reliable. The daughter graduated primary school with a small certificate. The son made the academy's first team at age 12. My wife returned to part-time work at a local accounting firm, handling payroll for small businesses. Our household ledger remained simple and balanced. Every major expense carried a receipt and a category. The habit had become invisible, like breathing. When the national team coach invited me to assist with the senior squad's midfield unit during a preparation camp, the contract arrived with the protective clauses already inserted. I reviewed them once, signed, and joined the staff. During the first video session, I paused on a clip from an international friendly where the midfield had lost compactness. The data overlay showed a 12% drop in collective pressing intensity after the 60th minute. I explained the numbers to the players without embellishment. They listened, took notes, and adjusted the next day's training accordingly. The camp ended with a clean sheet in the final friendly. The staff debrief was factual. Areas improved, metrics met, adjustments logged for the next cycle. No one mentioned past clubs or old scandals. The work spoke for itself. Years later, when young coaches asked how I had managed the transition from player to staff without bitterness, I gave the same calm answer every time. I kept the records. The records did the rest. They usually nodded and moved on to questions about pressing triggers or video analysis. That was fine. The full story was already written in the court files, the league bulletins, and the contract templates now used across the league. It no longer needed retelling. The shocking 4-0 home collapse that had once threatened to bury a decade of sacrifice had instead become the quiet catalyst for systemic change. 8 hidden truths had been compelled into the open through bank statements, forensic ledgers, sworn testimony, and enforceable judgments. The money had returned on schedule. The individuals responsible had been removed from influence. The league had strengthened its financial oversight, and one player had established boundaries that continued to protect others long after his own playing days ended. I sit now on the same balcony where the first bank statements were reviewed years ago. The bay is calm under the evening sky. The children are asleep inside. The master binder rests on the shelf, closed and undisturbed. The future contract checklist notebook lies open on the table. One more line added this afternoon after reviewing a new Federation circular on player welfare funds. The entry is simple and procedural, like all the rest. The game continues. Losses will still shock the stands. Scandals will still surface when records are ignored. But for those willing to document every transfer, every receipt, and every promise, the hidden truths will no longer remain hidden for long. The boundaries have been drawn in black and white, stamped by courts and adopted by the league. That is the only revenge that endures, not loud confrontation, but the calm, relentless power of evidence that outlasts any single board, any single defeat, and any single season. I close the notebook, switch off the light, and step inside. The apartment is quiet. The records are complete. The new life, built on clear terms and documented foundations, moves forward without need for further explanation. The years settled into a rhythm defined by routines that no longer required constant vigilance. I turned 50 the same week my new club secured its first silverware in the domestic cup competition. The final was played on a neutral ground in Ho Chi Minh City, under floodlights that cut through a light drizzle. We won 2-1 with a late goal from a set-piece routine we had drilled 17 times in the weeks leading up to the match. The GPS data showed our midfield maintained shape for 94% of the game, the highest figure recorded all season. After the whistle, the players celebrated in controlled bursts, hugging, exchanging jerseys, then lining up for the trophy presentation, exactly as the contract schedule required. No unscheduled bonuses were promised. No one asked me to cover travel costs for family members who had traveled to watch. The entire operation stayed within the documented budget. I accepted the small coaching award handed to me by the Federation representative with a brief nod of thanks. The plaque was placed in the club office beside the team photo. I took one copy home and set it on the shelf next to the court binder and the future contract checklist. The metal felt cool under my fingers. It carried no emotional charge, only the factual record of a season completed under clear, enforceable terms. The daughter finished lower secondary school with grades strong enough to choose her own path. The son, now 16, signed his first professional academy contract with the same club where I coached. The document was 9 pages long and included the protective addendum verbatim. He read every clause aloud at the kitchen table before signing. When he reached the section on documented contributions, he looked up and said, "Like what happened with your old club?" I answered simply, "Exactly like that. The records protect you before you need them." He nodded and finished signing. The contract was notarized the next morning. His first monthly stipend arrived on schedule, deposited directly into an account opened in his name with both parents as joint signatories. No undocumented support was ever requested or offered. My wife continued her part-time accounting work, now handling payroll compliance for 3 small sports-related businesses. She sometimes brought home sample contract templates for review. I checked them against the latest version of the checklist and suggested minor wording improvements where needed. The conversation stayed technical. Interest accrual rates, disclosure deadlines, audit triggers. The household ledger balanced every quarter with receipts filed in chronological order. The pattern had become invisible infrastructure, like the wiring behind the walls. One humid afternoon in the off-season, I received a formal letter from the Vietnam Football Federation inviting me to join a newly formed Financial Fair Play Advisory Committee. The appointment was for a 2-year term, unpaid except for documented travel and preparation expenses. The committee's mandate was to review league-wide contract templates and recommend updates to prevent the kind of undocumented player contributions that had once kept my old club afloat. I reviewed the appointment letter against my checklist, confirmed the expense reimbursement clause was properly worded, and accepted. The first meeting took place in Hanoi in a Federation conference room with neutral lighting and bottled water provided under official procurement rules. 8 former players and 3 accountants sat around the table. The agenda was distributed in advance. Review of historical cases involving delayed salaries, analysis of recent audit findings, and drafting of model clauses for player loan documentation. I spoke only when asked, citing specific transaction reference numbers and court exhibit labels from my own case, without embellishment. The committee members took notes. By the end of the day, we had agreed on a draft addendum requiring any player advance to be recorded in a standardized registry, cross-referenced to the club's audited accounts. The language was dry, precise, and enforceable. I suggested one additional line mandating quarterly disclosure to the squad captain. It was adopted without debate. The committee's recommendations were incorporated into the league regulations the following season. Clubs were now required to maintain a digital player contribution log accessible to the federation upon request. The first compliance reports showed a measurable drop in undocumented transfers across the league. The change moved quietly through the system, carried by updated circulars and audit checklists rather than headlines. I continued coaching the senior team through 2 more seasons, each one ending with salaries paid on time and bonuses distributed according to the exact metrics written into the contracts. The body that had once absorbed the cost of 10 undocumented years now moved with the caution of experience. I scheduled physiotherapy sessions every 6 weeks, paid through the club's documented medical budget. The knees still clicked, the shoulders still tightened in the rain, but the records ensured the care was covered without personal outlay. One quiet evening, the son brought home a school assignment asking him to interview a family member about a significant life lesson. He chose me. We sat at the kitchen table with the recorder on his phone. He asked straightforward questions. What was the hardest part of your playing career? How did you handle the 4-0 loss? What advice would you give young players today? I answered each one with facts drawn from the timeline rather than emotion. The loans totaled $187,400. The court recovered every dollar plus interest. The league sanctions removed the individuals responsible. The protective clauses now used across the league came directly from that experience. He listened without interrupting, then asked one final question. Do you ever regret giving so much without being asked? I paused only long enough to choose the precise wording. Regret implies the records were incomplete. The records were complete. They simply needed to be used at the right time. The interview ended there. He saved the file and thanked me. Later that week, he submitted the assignment with the transcript attached. The teacher gave it full marks for clarity and use of evidence. I did not ask to read the final version. The facts had already been tested in court. They did not need further validation. The old club continued its steady existence in the top flight. They avoided relegation battles and maintained the monthly financial disclosure requirement. The chairman and general manager from the time of the collapse remained barred under the 5-year injunction, which had long since expired without renewal. Their names no longer appeared in any official capacity. The club's balance sheet showed consistent, if modest, surpluses. Ticket revenue and sponsorships flowed through documented channels. No new scandals surfaced because the records prevented them from staying hidden. I retired from full-time coaching at the end of the following season. The farewell event was small, held in the club canteen with coffee and sandwiches provided under the hospitality budget. The president read a short statement citing my contribution to tactical discipline and contract compliance. I thanked the staff, shook hands, and left with a single folder containing the final season's performance data and payment confirmations. The master binder remained on the shelf at home, untouched for another year. The daughter started university in economics, specializing in sports management. She sometimes brought home case studies from her courses. One semester, the curriculum included a module on financial governance in professional football. The reading list referenced a journal article that cited our case as a landmark example of player-initiated enforcement. She asked me about it over dinner. I answered with the same measured tone I had used in court. The transfers were documented with bank references and handwritten receipts. The forgery was disproven by hospital records. The court ordered full repayment and imposed sanctions. The league strengthened its rules as a result. She took notes on her laptop, then closed it and said, "You turned a loss into a regulation." I corrected her gently. The records turned the loss into a regulation. I only kept the records. The son signed his first senior contract the same year. The document was 14 pages long and included every clause from the latest protective addendum. He reviewed it with me line by line at the kitchen table. When we reached the section on player contributions, he looked up and smiled. No quiet loans. I nodded once. No quiet loans. Life moved forward under those terms. The bay outside the apartment remained the same. The city lights reflected in steady lines on calm water. The children grew into adults who understood the value of documented boundaries. My wife and I marked anniversaries with quiet dinners and updated household ledgers. The body that had once carried the club on undocumented faith now walked the same coastal path each morning, steps measured, breathing even. The shocking 4-0 defeat that had once threatened to erase 10 years of sacrifice had instead become the quiet foundation for a different kind of legacy. 8 hidden truths had been compelled into the official record through bank statements, forensic analysis, sworn testimony, and enforceable judgments. The money had returned. The individuals had been removed. The league had changed its rules. And one player had established safeguards that continued to protect others long after his own name faded from the team sheet. I no longer keep the future contract checklist notebook on the table. It rests on the shelf beside the master binder, closed but ready if needed. The work of documentation never truly ends, but it no longer requires daily attention. The boundaries have been drawn, tested in court, adopted by the league, and passed to the next generation through clear, enforceable language. The game continues. New players will still pour their time and bodies into clubs that sometimes forget the value of records. New defeats will still shock the stands. But for those willing to keep the receipts, to file the statements, to insist on the clauses, the hidden truths will surface when they must. The revenge is not loud or dramatic. It is procedural, relentless, and permanent. I stand on the balcony one last time as the evening settles over Da Nang Bay. The air is warm, the water dark and calm. 10 years of quiet sacrifice have been fully accounted for. The next 10 years, and the years after that, will be lived under terms the records can enforce. No more undocumented loans. No more convenient scapegoats. Only facts, contracts, court stamps, and the calm certainty that when the next shocking defeat arrives, the documents will already be in place to reveal exactly what lies behind it. The story ends here, not with fireworks or final confrontations, but with the quiet click of a binder closing and the steady rhythm of a life rebuilt on evidence rather than assumption. That is the only ending the records would support, and it is more than enough.